So, thanks for joining us, everyone, and welcome to a very special program that the Hamden Public Library is fortunate to be able to present to you this evening. My name is Michael Pieri, and I'm an adult services librarian at the Miller Library, although I'm currently Zooming from my home in Middletown. Before we get started and I introduce our guests, I just wanted to remind you all to visit our website, hamdenlibrary.org, where you can find more great programming. And you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter. Tonight our guests are two residents of the Spring Glen neighborhood in Hamden. Um, Marissa Dionne Mead is a licensed architect and a sculptor experienced in multiple mediums, including wood, aluminum, bronze casting, and fiberglass. She earned her Bachelor of Architecture with honors from the University of Notre Dame with a concentration in furniture design. She was named this is quite recent, I think, one of Connecticut Magazine's 40 Under 40, class of 2021. Her civic work designs have received national recognition, including New Britain's sculptural Beehive Bridge and her pro bono design of the New Haven Botanical Garden of Healing, which was named Editor's Choice for Best Unbuilt Design in the Architect's Newspaper. Um, and Danielle Chapman is a poet, essayist, and lecturer in English at Yale University. Her poems have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, The Nation, Poetry International, and elsewhere. Delinquent Palaces, released by Northwestern University Press in April 2015, is her debut collection of poems. And for several years, Danielle served as the Director of Literary Arts and Events for Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs, where she created programs to serve Chicago's writers, publishers, and literary community. She was also a consulting editor for the Poetry Foundation. So Danielle and Marissa are actually the co-founders of Spring Forward, a task force for housing equity based out of Spring Glen, where they live, as I said. And tonight they're going to present on the historical policies and current practices that have created racial and economic inequality in towns across Connecticut, including Hamden. They're also going to offer suggestions for how Hamden can increase housing choice and dispel some of the myths that lead communities to reject affordable and multifamily housing. So, yeah, that's it. With that, I would turn it over to you guys. You guys ready?
Yes. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. That was really
No
nice.
problem.
And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael. I don't think I ever would have known otherwise that Marissa designed furniture, but now I'm going to hit you up about that.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, should we get started?
I think yes.
Okay. So this is our presentation, Understanding Housing Inequity in Connecticut. Spring Forward is a group of Hamden residents seeking to address racial and economic segregation in our town by creating more housing opportunity for all. Currently, our group is 200 members and growing. We started as a Facebook group, and that's still where we meet and share information.
So we got a really great introduction from Michael, so we probably don't need to go too deeply into that, but I just wanted to share why I in particular have been interested in this effort. I think once I realized that our neighborhood wasn't segregated by chance or necessarily by choice, I wanted to learn more about the factors why that was. And as an architect, I'm specifically licensed to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of all people in the built environment. And I realized that all of these factors are impacted by the housing opportunities that people have available to them. And so I wanted to get more involved in making our neighborhood more inclusive.
Yeah, and similarly, thank you again, Michael, for that great introduction. as Michael mentioned, I'm a writer, and racial justice has been a focus of my work and my writing for many years. But when I moved to Spring Glen, I just, did what a lot of people did and just sort of found myself in a place that I realized after the fact was a segregated neighborhood. And so I think that kind of indicated to me that despite, my beliefs, I am part of the system. And so I hope that our work at Spring Forward can make a difference by starting in our own community. And before we get going on the presentation, I just wanted to mention that we both think it's important to acknowledge that we're two white women presenting on this topic. So while housing equity is an issue that we're both very passionate about, we recognize that there are limits to how much empathy can accomplish. No matter how much we care about the injustice created by racial inequality, we can't necessarily understand the experience of those who have suffered it. And also, we're doing this work in part because we want to take responsibility for our part in the system. And we don't seek to blame anyone in particular for it. We know that these are huge historical problems and we all play our part. It will require generational change, and we can all play a part in addressing these problems.
As a group, one of our first priorities was really to educate ourselves and educate a lot of our neighbors so that we could best support and amplify the work of the many people and organizations that are already doing this work, particularly groups that are minority-led in our community. We're not looking to reinvent the wheel. We want to make sure we're educated so that we can be most helpful and add our energy to the sort of overall collective effort that includes a broad range of perspectives and experiences. These organizations on this slide are some of the folks we've been learning about. Some we're involved with directly, others we have just become associated with. We encourage folks to learn about the work of these groups if you're not already familiar, because they're all doing really great things, both on the sort of civil rights side and the land use side.
So why housing? Though most Connecticut residents are proud supporters of racial equality, we are actually one of the most segregated states in America. And many people think that neighborhoods in America are segregated de facto, that is by custom, because people want to live around people who are like them. But the truth is that until the 1960s, the federal government segregated America's housing de jure, which means by laws that refuse to allow integration. While many believe that housing inequality is just the way it is, it's actually the result of very specific federal and local policies that can be changed. Why now? So you may recognize these signs. We see them all over the place since last summer. And these are actually photos that Marissa took of signs in our neighborhood. A sea of them went up in Spring Glen, and a lot of us felt proud of our neighborhood's progressive attitude. But as I mentioned before, this was also an occasion for a lot of us to look around and realize that very few people of color lived in our neighborhood. And we started to ask ourselves why. And to begin to do research, to collaborate, to figure out just really specifically what was preventing people of color from buying homes here. So as people who support the movement for racial justice taking place around the nation, we want to be part of positive change, and we realized that the place to start was our own backyards. So we really think that in order to understand the current situation, one needs to understand the history of housing inequity in the US. So the next portion of the presentation will be a little bit of US history and local history on government policies. So a lot of what we see today started in the 1930s with FDR's New Deal policies. These made a big investment in America's neighborhoods in an effort to pull the country out of the Depression. So the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, they began backing mortgages on new homes. And this allowed families with very little savings to pull themselves out of poverty and buy homes. And that set off a track of upward mobility for generations for the families that were able to buy into the housing market at that time. At the same time, public housing was initially created for middle-class families, but was segregated even in communities that had been formerly integrated. So what primarily happened was that whites were resettled in what we would now think of as suburban neighborhoods, and blacks were settled in urban centers. And so even neighborhoods that previously had experienced a lot of integration, in order to get into these new homes, people were resegregated. And then what really made this problem much deeper was that FHA loan officers were prohibited from granting mortgages to black buyers who wanted to move to white neighborhoods. This is an example of a deed from Spring Glen, I don't know the exact date of but before the 1950s. But it's an existing deed that somebody has on their house today, because a lot of these houses were purchased before 1950. So what happened was that real estate developers and homeowners associations designated entire suburbs as whites only, and the FHA supported this practice by guaranteeing their home loans. Meanwhile, they refused African Americans these home loans, and they did it through these kinds of exclusionary deeds. So as you can see, the highlighted part here says, no persons of any race other than the white race shall use or occupy any buildings on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent the occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or a tenant. So as I said, this is a deed that somebody still has on their house. And, you know, a lot of us were really surprised when this turned up. And then we found out that this was the case for most of the streets, most of the houses in Spring Glen. The thing is that federal and private banks required this kind of language in deeds for homes as a condition for lending money. And this resulted in the practice known as redlining, which we'll talk more about in a minute, in which neighborhoods were rated according to how safe or how risky it was for a bank to insure a mortgage there. The Supreme Court declared these deeds unconstitutional in 1948, but the FHA backed whites-only subdivisions and developments all the way until the Fair Housing Act of the 1960s outlawed it. Putting up walls. So to qualify for loans and to make these whites-only developments, some developers struck deals with the Federal Housing Authority, and they did things like building fences, walls, and other kinds of barriers to separate new developments from existing black neighborhoods. And this is an example in Hamden. A 12-foot chain link fence was built as a compromise with white Hamden residents who objected to the construction of nearby public housing. And what happened as a result of this is that black residents had to take several long bus rides to reach jobs and shops that were just directly across the fence. So it's kind of a symbol of how absurd some of these measures were and how difficult they made the lives of some of the black residents who were on the other side of them. So redlining and deeds. This is a redlined map of Greater New Haven, including Hamden. Redlining was rampant between 1934 and the 1970s. the federal government, the FHA, allowed homeowners loan corporations to identify risk areas based on race. So banks would deny mortgages to people who lived in red line areas, while granting them to those in neighborhoods like Spring Glen, which, as you can see, was given an A. So the green areas on the map are graded A. That means that they are safe investments, whereas the red areas are given a D, which means that they are risky investments. So basically that meant that if you lived in an African American neighborhood, you were automatically labeled high risk. This didn't necessarily mean that it was because the housing was in poor repair. It didn't even necessarily mean that it was a lower income neighborhood. It simply meant that it was an African American neighborhood, and that automatically gave the neighborhood a rating of red or D, or high risk. So what this meant is that only white people could get loans. And meanwhile, because housing was in such short supply for African Americans, lenders could charge them very high prices under very unfavorable terms, including something that you might have heard of called contract loans, which are very high price loans, kind of similar to something like a subprime loan that we might see today, but a very harsh loan in which if the client defaults on a single payment, they lose the entire value of their loan. So eventually subsidized housing became concentrated in the large towers that we're familiar with in urban areas, and these further isolated non-white residents. And this means that there are other consequences to this kind of discriminatory practice, because redlining has not just led to unbalanced housing, it also has other consequences. Some of those are reduced access to education and opportunity, poorer public services, profiling by law enforcement, poorer health outcomes because of proximity to industry and a higher incidence of asthma and other illnesses, and even intense heat. Because red line neighborhoods are hotter. Red line neighborhoods are hotter largely because they lack trees to provide shade. And I just heard on the radio that this is becoming yesterday, this is becoming in Cleveland, there is a social justice movement for something called tree equity. So that's a movement that is gaining speed. Okay, so that's a lot of information, a lot of history condensed in a short period. And some people might be asking themselves, well, okay, that's definitely wrong that this happened, but isn't it illegal to practice housing discrimination now? And that is true. It is illegal. However, the segregation that we see today is a direct result of some of those discriminatory practices of the past. I think the key point is that because white suburban buyers were able to buy homes in the 1930s or whenever it happened to be, when they were able to buy into the market at a very low price, at the same time, African Americans were completely shut out of the market because it was illegal for them to buy those homes. They were settled in other places. What this means is that white buyers have gained equity in their homes over generations. They've built wealth, and this wealth has financed education, healthcare, and all sorts of things that could be passed down to their kids. So homes purchased initially by white families in an exclusive market have now appreciated beyond the reach of African American families who could have purchased those homes originally if they had been allowed to. So exclusion from the housing market has created a wealth gap, and it is a very important reason for the wealth gap that we see today, in which Black incomes are approximately 60% of white incomes, but wealth is only 5 to 10%. And Richard Rothstein, who is the author of The Color of Law, which is a fantastic book that we really recommend, he says that he thinks the country's wealth gap is entirely attributable to unconstitutional housing policy. So I will turn it over now to Marissa. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Danielle. So we're going to talk a little bit about zoning practices, because once the racial discrimination policies that Danielle outlined became illegal, many towns turned to zoning regulations to maintain what they saw as preferable existing segregation patterns. And there are several key zoning regulations that tend to reinforce segregation without being racially explicit. All across Connecticut, Hamden included, specific zoning policies have narrowed the selection of housing, narrowed the housing opportunity for certain populations. One of the ways zoning does that is through single family zoning. So single family zoning is allowed in almost the entire state, 91% of the state, while multifamily housing is allowed in only 2 to 4%. And a lot of places that do allow for multifamily housing only allow it in very small areas that are pretty undesirable. The zoning regulations are often also more restrictive than the previously established settlement pattern of a neighborhood. So for example, Spring Glen on this map, every single property that's orange and red is smaller than the allowable lot size for the neighborhood. So this indicates to me that the rules sort of changed. Once racial discrimination wasn't legal anymore, the rules changed. A lot of towns require pretty large minimum lot sizes, up to 2 acres, in order to build a single family home, or home sizes up to 1,800 square foot minimum to build. And so obviously this excludes a lot of folks from building more modest homes on smaller lots. And that has an economic component to it, which is because of the wealth gap, also very closely tied to a racial inequity. There are also parking minimums that towns impose that often require excessive parking requirements. So for example, the very small commercial center of Spring Glen, which on this map is labeled as T3.5, currently requires 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit, even for a small studio apartment. So what this does is it makes it very expensive and often unfeasible for a developer to create multifamily housing, because it just requires so much land for parking. There are also a lot of restrictions on ADUs, or accessory dwelling units. So an accessory dwelling unit is a small, usually sort of one dwelling unit that's attached or on the property of a primary house. And this type of living situation allows homeowners to gain equity through rental income. And it also adds rental units, typically in higher opportunity areas. But a lot of towns put just undue restrictions on ADUs, and so they become pretty much unfeasible in a lot of locations. And with any of these zoning regulations, applicants can apply for a variance or a special permit, but this often requires a public hearing, which subjects applicants to these drawn out, lengthy, often expensive processes, which subject them to protests from folks those not in my backyard folks. And a lot of people just don't want to deal with that hassle, and so they move on, they go somewhere else. So what are the effects of zoning in our towns? In Spring Glen, for example, you can see in a comparison of these 2 maps. The map on the left is a measure of racial diversity, and the map on the right is the red line map that Danielle reviewed earlier. So the area in the circle is Spring Glen. And what we can see on the diversity map, so the colors represent the odds that any 2 neighbors are of a different ethnic background. The darker the color, the higher the odds, the lighter the color, the lower the odds. So in Spring Glen, which is a very light green, indicates that we have very low chance of being a different race from our neighbors. And so this correlation between the red line map and existing diversity indicates that these patterns that were established by redlining really do continue today, and that is mostly due to zoning practices. Another thing to note about Spring Glen in particular is it's sort of a unique neighborhood. It's very similar to the adjacent neighborhood, so it has similar density of housing, similar housing stock, the same utility lines, same transportation run as adjacent neighborhoods, but it's significantly less diverse, and it has a much more significant history of exclusionary practices. So as mentioned, the zoning regulations can be cumbersome to positive community development. It can also deter property owners and developers from enhancing and improving properties. Currently, Whitney Avenue in Spring Glen is missing a lot of the smaller scale mixed use buildings that would typically define a village. And we believe this is due to existing zoning overlays that add additional zoning restrictions to the commercial corridor in our neighborhood. So we have several concerns with the existing overlay. It restricts the number of living units per acre. It has very unclear design guidelines. It lays out incorrect correlations between density and negative safety and walkability outcomes. And it just overall prioritizes single family zoning instead of the mixed use type development that you would typically see in an area like this. So as a group, for our neighborhood, we'd like to introduce more housing options that suit a broader range of housing preferences and income levels. Our group has engaged with the Spring Glen Civic Association, who were the original authors of the overlay. And we are currently working with them, collaborating with them, sharing information about all of this history in order to revisit the zoning regulations for this area and hopefully improve them for the better, to be more inclusive. So housing diversity is a term I want to define because I think this is really important to talk about when we're talking about mixed use and multifamily. I think when we talk about these things in the suburbs, we have to sort of dispel the idea of these massive towers, these huge developments that aren't connected to anything, and instead talk about housing diversity, which includes a mix of single family and multifamily homes. It includes something called middle housing or gentle density, which includes smaller scale multifamily buildings, so sort of 4 to 10 units, and also those ADUs or accessible accessory dwelling units that provide the rental income and additional rental units. And all this introduces something called natural affordability. So not necessarily subsidized housing, but smaller scale units like apartments or condos that can attract younger families, empty nesters, artists, essential workers. And the housing diversity does also, of course, include a percentage of subsidized housing, which must be incorporated throughout so that people of different income levels can still choose where they want to live. The small multifamily housing is something that's really lacking in Connecticut right now. And this type of housing provides affordable, efficient housing that works well almost anywhere, especially in the suburbs. The images on this page, one of which is in Spring Glen already, indicate what that sort of suburban housing diversity might mean. It's duplexes, it's small commercial buildings with residential over retail. So to build back this missing middle, in Connecticut, we really have to press for both zoning reform because current zoning laws really often prevent this type of building right now. And we need to press for financial investment at the state level because right now at the state level, they really have a lot of programs in place to provide support for very large developments, and some programs in place to support single family homeowners. And so that missing middle is not only missing from our landscape, but it's missing from our legislative agenda too. So another thing we want to talk about today is to outline some of the myths about affordable housing. There is really a national housing shortage of affordable options for working families. Open Communities Alliance is a civil rights housing organization in Connecticut. They estimate that Connecticut needs to add over 100,000 units of affordable living in the state. And Hamden's fair share of that might be about 1,500 units. So people need housing. They need housing that's reasonably priced, whether that's natural affordable or subsidized. And if we go forward the way we've been practicing building housing, adding these units only in areas that are already dense with housing will only contribute further to economic and racial segregation. So the following slides will highlight some of the housing myths that we hear in zoning reviews and hearings all over the state. These are the myths that hold our suburbs back from meeting housing needs for their communities. So first is the myth that there is a fiscal or infrastructure burden due to multifamily. So there's a concern about a lack of services or finances or infrastructure to support multifamily housing in suburbs, but this just really isn't supported by the data. On the infrastructure side, housing is needed anyway. Multifamily housing is more efficient naturally. It requires shorter utility lines and a smaller service radius. Multifamily units also use less water per unit than single family homes, even when you account for household size and seasonal differences. That's mostly due to things like gardens and lawn watering and that sort of thing. And on the financial side, apartments often generate more property taxes than single family homes. And there's also this argument about, well, but the environment, multifamily housing isn't good for the environment. But again, the multifamily housing is more efficient. You know, opponents of the multifamily will sort of fall back on this argument, but it's really sort of an undefined concern. Many of these arguments are typically disingenuous and lack professional evidence. It's sort of a way to just postpone an application. Some environmental concerns are, of course, valid, but these will always be a problem if no one is allowed to propose a solution. So one of our Spring Forward members is a civil engineer working in New Haven, and I wanted to share a quote from him, which I think is poignant. He said, "The suburban grass is so green and those yards are so clean, it's easy to forget diversity is crucial to the environment, both socially and ecologically." So we talk about how a large development might negatively impact a local ecosystem, but how often do we talk about how harmful suburban lawns are? They are devastating to ecosystems. So like most things, when multifamily housing is executed poorly, the property values can be negatively impacted. But often multifamily housing can increase the property value of nearby homes, even in high income areas. Just one second. Hey, Vera. This is Vera. She's saying hi. Vera. Go downstairs, please. 3, 2. Okay. So yeah, property values is an argument that comes up a lot. But again, if it's done poorly, of course, it's going to have a negative impact. But when it's done well, time and time again, multifamily housing has proven to be an asset in all kinds of neighborhoods. Residential stability. So opponents of rental housing often argue that People who own their homes are more invested in the long-term success of a community, while the people who just rent are just sort of short-term and less desirable neighbors because they're less invested in the community. But the data indicates that actually renters are equally or more involved in their communities. They're more likely to socialize with their neighbors. They're just as likely to vote. Next is traffic. So there's sort of two concerns around traffic. One is the quantity of cars, and the second is the speed. So on average, apartment residents own fewer cars than single family homeowners, and also generate fewer automobile trips per household. And mixed use development along a commercial corridor like Whitney Avenue actually brings with it things like retail frontage and street parking, bike lanes, striped crosswalks. All of these things tend to slow traffic. So on the speed side, if you do multifamily and mixed use well, you'll actually slow traffic and increase the walk appeal of your neighborhood. So crime. When we think about crime, we should really focus on policy and place, not affordable housing or the people who live there. I think associating occupants of affordable or multifamily housing with crime is just another way that discriminatory housing policies have permeated our culture. It's really policy and municipal neglect that create concentrations of poverty and unrest, not the people. This is a false correlation that continues today on zoning boards, public hearings, in real estate brokerages and banks all over the country. You hear, well, we don't want, those people here, we don't want them to bring crime, but it's really not about the people. The places where very large multifamily were created, like this example, the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis, which was sort of a notorious story about the failure of a very large housing complex, really demonstrate the failure of the municipality. It was an unfortunate circumstance resulting from a number of factors, but most significantly the neglect of the city. And instead, the residents were blamed for the failure of this complex, and it really was not their fault. The second thing is place. So the quality of our places is vitally important. An epidemiologist named Charles Branas from Columbia University has spent decades studying cities and doing these treatments of blighted lots and vacant lots to see what would happen, what would be the impact on the city. And what they found is that once these sites had been remediated, there was a reduction in not only the perceived crime of that lot, in and around that lot, but also the actual crime rate of that area went down. And the criminal activity didn't just relocate, it didn't just go somewhere else that seemed more appealing, it stopped altogether. So when small lots in a city were remediated, the overall crime level of the city went down. So policy matters, design matters, investing in the maintenance and rehabilitation of our underserved areas is really crucial. So crime is really a symptom of a city problem. It's not from the people. The bootstraps argument. For some folks, hard work and good luck have helped them overcome the odds, but this just really isn't a reality for so many people. And if we just quickly look at some of the statistics in Connecticut, I think most people would agree that a family with one or two parents working full-time should be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. But this is not the case in Connecticut. In 2020, the United Way did a report that revealed that 38% of working households in our state have an income that falls below what's needed to pay for basic necessities. And those basic necessities include housing. So these are people who are working and they just cannot afford housing. And that's 38% of our population. An additional 10% are in poverty. So when you add that together, that is half of our population. And so if you look at a situation and just say, well, you just need to work harder, that's a pretty disingenuous argument. The I'm not racist, you're racist argument. So these conversations can be difficult. We're not going to pretend these are not difficult conversations. Sometimes folks have this knee-jerk reaction to conversations about improving housing because these conversations require the acknowledgement and presence of racial discrimination. And some folks might feel attacked, like they're being blamed, or other people might feel that there's too much focus on the correlation between race and wealth, and that's offensive to people who aren't white. But here's the thing. Almost the entirety of housing inequity is due to more than 100 years of policies that were fueled by racism. So from personal racism, individual racism, all the way to systemic federal racism. And this just can't be ignored. Ignoring race will not solve a problem that was created by race.
Thanks, Marissa. That was so much good information. And, so this is everything that we've told you guys so far is kind of the background of what the situation that exists in Hamden, in Connecticut, really across America. And so these are the reasons that our group formed. We have, I think it's a little over a year that we've been meeting and trying to figure out what we can do about some of this. So these are the 4 areas that we've identified for how we can make change. The first is zoning. Marissa gave you a lot of great background on that and on the specific situation in Hamden. So we've been working on this pretty specifically on trying to revise the design overlay that exists in Spring Glen, and which makes any kind of development in the area that people know as the Walgreens lot, but really the whole commercial corridor there in Spring Glen, and actually the whole neighborhood, which as Marissa mentioned, is zoned as R4. So we would like to see some more flexibility there and some more housing diversity. And in the name of that, we've been working with the Spring Glen Civic Association to revise this design overlay. And that's been a really productive process, I think, and we're moving forward on that quite productively. We're applying for a grant to get design guidelines written, and we've been pleased with how we've been able to work together and to just kind of move on that. The second area is development. So I already mentioned the corridor along Whitney. We've begun to reach out to some of the businesses along that corridor in order to figure out, if people are interested in building some affordable or middle housing there, and that really requires a very fulsome community engagement process. And so we're just beginning to figure out how to do that. We've also had conversations about other ideas like crosswalk painting, and Marissa has a lot of experience with that and with all sorts of community engagement. So we've had some promising conversations about just revitalizing some of Hamden's neighborhoods with stuff like that. And we're also trying to facilitate a new Habitat for Humanity project in Hamden. Excuse me. The third area is advocacy, so legislative advocacies in particular. We're in touch with all of our local representatives, and we recently supported 2 bills that went to the state legislature. One, a fair housing bill, and the other, a bill to encourage reform in zoning. Both of these bills ultimately resulted in one bill called HB 6107, which makes some modest changes to zoning, including allowing more ADUs, reducing some of that parking requirement and increasing training for local commissioners. And finally, outreach. That's what we're doing tonight. And we've given lots of presentations over the past 6 months or so to 3 different civic associations, Hampden Plains, Whitneyville, and Spring Glen. Also to the Democratic Town Committee, Hampden Action Now, the American Institute for Architects. And we also coordinated a presentation to all of the congregations in Spring Glen. So we did one faith-based presentation. Outreach is really the core of our work, and if you are interested in having us present, please let us know. Okay, so what can I do now? First of all, you can sign up for our mailing list, our newsletter, or you can join our Facebook group, or both. We're just Spring Forward. Look for us. We are easy to find. And here are a couple action items of things that you could do right now if you are interested. You can always email your legislators on our Facebook page. You can find out what's going on right now. But just provide written support for fair housing and land use reform proposals. You can also just research zoning codes and real estate practices in your town. I'm assuming most people here are from Hampden, but just finding out the story on your street, in your neighborhood, finding out that local history is really informative. You can also just bring people together and spread the word. And we're happy to help facilitate that. And also just share your story. A lot of people, particularly Hampden residents who have lived here all of their lives, have personal stories about housing in Hampden, and we would love to hear those. This is a short movie that is a synopsis of Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. We really recommend it. This is a fabulous book. If you want to know more about this topic, this is our top recommendation. And that is it. Thank you so much for having us, and we would love to take questions if anybody has them.
Thank you. That was amazing. Yeah, I think they should be able to use chat and to put in questions, or if anybody wants to raise their hand, we can also unmute you.
Also, there was a question in a private message about sharing the presentation, and we can do that. We could send to you, Michael, a PDF version of the presentation with some notes.
Okay, great.
If you'd like to send that out to anybody who's interested.
Absolutely. Let me send a. Let's see. I think I have chat for people. Oh, there we go. Yep. Okay, can you guys see the chat? Oh, this is a direct message to me. Okay. Are there other neighborhoods in Hampden that mimic Spring Glen?
That is a good question. I mean, I think there are definitely other neighborhoods in Hampden that have had exclusionary practices. But Spring Glen, I think, is unique in a way where, because it's so similar to adjacent neighborhoods, because it's so close to New Haven, it has fairly dense housing, it's very accessible via public transport, but has remained starkly white, I think sort of sets Spring Glen apart on the exclusionary spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one reason we felt like, okay, yeah, we need to start here.
Right.
Anecdotally, from longtime Hampden residents, I've heard Mount Carmel has a similar reputation. I think that Mount Carmel has diversified quite a bit more in recent years because there are developments there, and maybe because of Quinnipiac. But again, the demographics of Mount Carmel are pretty different.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Just to add one more thing to that, um, I'd be really we haven't dug into the history of other neighborhoods the way that we have
Mm-hmm.
in Spring Glen. But if people live in other neighborhoods and wanted to start doing that, we would love to hear whatever you find out. We found out a lot about our neighborhood from a lifelong resident who's really interested in local history. So
Mm-hmm.
he was the person who dug up a lot of the specifics. So yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and from friends who and acquaintances of color who had experienced discrimination trying to buy homes in Spring Glen.
Oh, that's good because somebody just asked what feedbacks or insights you've heard from people of color. So, um,
Yeah, so I mean, these are certainly not my own stories or stories that I feel that I should share on anybody else's behalf. But we did hear over the summer as our group was forming stories from 3 or 4 friends and acquaintances who had recent experiences trying to buy homes, or in one instance, somebody who lived here briefly but then moved away, about difficulties they had with the real estate process or just sort of odd behavior from neighbors in the neighborhood once they arrived.
mm,
So. And
um,
certainly we know not, Spring Glen isn't the end all be all. Not everybody wants to live here.
right.
Of
Yeah.
course, there are many other places to live that are awesome and interesting and more inclusive and more integrated than Spring Glen, where people want to live. But we
But you
certainly
start where you
wouldn't
live,
want,
right?
yeah, we wouldn't want people to be someone who wants to live here and can afford to live here to be rejected based on their racial background.
Yeah. Oh, I jotted down a couple of notes. So how many folks do you have in the group right now in the Spring Forward? Like,
That's a good question. Usually it's close to 200 in the Facebook group, and then we have another sort of list serve of folks who are involved or connected just via email who might not necessarily be on Facebook. So
mhm.
um, overall, somewhere over 300 folks that we're connected to.
And like, so you guys are kind of the leaders, so you're the ones working with the zoning commissions and stuff like that, right?
Yeah,
Or,
so we've sort of spearheaded a couple initiatives. We schedule the meetings, but what we try to do every meeting is have folks come in to present. And so we've had a number of really interesting presentations, panel discussions from folks all over Hamden or experts in housing to come in to present at our monthly meetings. And so that's been really great to hear from
well, that's great. I mean,
people. Mm-hmm.
don't be surprised if you hear from our director because I think she'd probably want more of this kind of stuff.
Great.
um, the only other thing, and this is totally tangential, but you mentioned briefly suburban lawns and how they have like a negative environmental impact. I wanted to highlight that because I don't think people are aware of that. Could you talk about that at all?
Um, sure. I'm sure there are many folks who are more of an expert than I am, but um, typical lawns that you see in the suburbs are not naturally occurring. These are
Yeah.
man-made spaces that typically decimate existing ecosystems. They do not support wildlife. They're often recipients of a lot of pesticides and herbicides that
Hmm.
leach into the ground, contaminating a much broader area than the lawn itself. And so I think, yeah, a lot of times people look at a green space or a big green lawn and think, oh, that looks nice and natural, but it's not. It's fabricated. It doesn't support the local ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Um, well, unless we have any other questions, um, we could probably end it because it's about 7:30 now.
Okay.
Oh wait, I did see something here. Is there any idea or data on how the eviction moratorium lifting is going to impact this pattern. I'd assume it would exacerbate it. That's an
I
interesting question.
I would think so too. Yeah, well, I know that folks like Justin Farmer, who's a legislative council member in Hamden, is working really hard to make sure that there are support systems in place for when the moratorium is lifted. I think there have been some positive moves in that direction from the state, but I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, I would agree that anything negative that happens in the economy or in the culture typically exacerbates these existing problems.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then someone else asked, what neighborhood is the opposite of Spring Glen? Kind of a, I don't know if there's a good answer to that, but that's a
Well,
fun question.
I've heard a couple people have put forward their neighborhoods as opposite. I mean, I haven't done any, we haven't researched this, but people from Dunbar Hill
Mhm.
have told me that they love their neighborhood because it's so diverse, and people from Whitneyville say the same thing. And in Whitneyville, it's not just racial diversity, but there's also housing diversity.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, if you go back to that diversity map, you can sort of see neighborhoods that are doing better. So yeah, anecdotally, we thought Whitneyville was doing better, and they are. They have a much better percentage of folks with diverse backgrounds who live next to one another. Other neighborhoods in Southern Hamden, but yeah, the diversity map has been really interesting to look at and sort of overlay with the red line map.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, I think that's a really good way to wrap up. And I want to thank you guys again. That was really an awesome presentation. And everybody sign up for the Facebook page if you're on Facebook. Or I saw at least one person put their email in to sign up for you guys' email, so I'll send that to you.
And you have that email. Have we publicized the email?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I get it right.
Right. I realize on the topic that said, on the slide that says sign up now, I don't think I said
Yeah,
what you
don't think
sign up for.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm typing it into the chat now. springforwardhousing@gmail.
Okay. springforwardhousing@gmail.com.
Okay, and then they can just email you guys and they'll be signed up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, thank you guys again. It was great. I hope we can host you guys again for something like this or something in the future. Maybe even in person if
Yeah.
the world allows it.
Nice. Yeah. Right.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation and the chance to do this.
Absolutely. Have a good night and hope to see you guys again.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.